Welcome, friends. We're glad to see you tonight. I want to thank you for coming out this evening. I also want to introduce you to a very special guest, Reverend Harold Middlebrook, who is with us tonight. I hope you'll take a look after the service, if you can't see from where you're seated, at some of these pictures of events in his life. Reverend Middlebrook is someone who is a national hero, a state hero, but a beloved member and leader for decades of our Knoxville community. And many of you, as we've been preparing for this evening, have gotten to know a little bit about his biography. And you know that he was, I believe, youth pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, the church of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his father, where they pastored. Also, he was very involved in the sanitation workers strike in Memphis, which you are familiar with, and also was there with Martin Luther King on the last day of his life at the Lorraine Motel. Now, he's been a leader here in Knoxville for over, since I believe, is it 1977? 77 here in Knoxville, and we're very thankful for that. I can tell you that when I first got to know Reverend Middlebrook, it was almost 20 years ago. And I was working at the time. I had a friend named Justin, and Justin knew Reverend Middlebrook. And Justin and I like to sit around and we like to talk about good preaching and what good preaching was like and what good preaching was not like. And Justin said, well, if you want to hear good preaching, you need to come hear Reverend Middlebrook. And he's having a revival at his church this week. Let's go hear him together. So we went out to hear Reverend Middlebrook, and Justin told me nothing of Reverend Middlebrook's background. Being back in Knoxville for the first time in some time, I was not familiar with him, and we went and heard a great sermon. And then afterwards, as you might guess, Reverend Middlebrook invited us to go out to dinner with him. And I sat through a full dinner. And he's never said, by the way, I knew Martin Luther King as a friend, as a colleague. He never said he was involved in the sanitation workers strike. He never said any of these amazing things he's done in his life. He simply answered all the questions a young preacher had about preaching, and he asked me about my family. And that I found in him such a sincere spirit. And I want to let you know, if you came tonight to hear nothing but his preaching skill, then you made a very wise decision with your time. But he brings so much more than just skillful preaching. He brings a depth of wisdom and experience of commitment to Christ and commitment to living out Christ's way in our world that I know will bless you. So, Reverend Middlebrook, will you come share with us?
Well, thank you very much. I had to take my time. A few days ago, I would have just run up those steps, and time has a way of catching up with you. I want to thank you for that appreciation, that introduction. I really appreciate it. I wish my wife had been here. She doesn't believe all that stuff, She tells everybody she's only been with me 60 years. And so she says, I know what y'all don't know. And I say, please don't tell it. I have a lot of friends that I've met over the years in this audience tonight, and I'm really glad to see y'all. Thank you for the invitation to come and share. I apologize. Last month was an exceptionally busy month. And believe it or not, for the first time in my life, there were some things happening that I had to say no to. Up until this year, if you said, come work with us, come do anything, I said yes. And a little sickness got a hold of me, a little age, and I found myself having to say no to some things. But I'm glad you gave me another chance, and I hope I don't disappoint you all. You made one mistake. You said I'm a leader. I'm a foot soldier. I do not profess to be a leader. I try to help people to figure out for themselves where we ought to be going and what we ought to be doing. And I merely raise some questions about where you are. What was it that motivated many of us to become involved? Well, I'm convinced. Well, let me say first of all that a couple of people really had a lot of influence in my life. Martin King, of course, my grandmother and my mother, but James Morris Lawson. Anybody know that name? Jim Lawson was one of the great leaders of this nation for nonviolence and civil rights. He was a United Methodist preacher, and he pastored his last church was the Church of the Bells in California. We wanted him to be a bishop in Memphis, but Memphis wasn't ready for Jim, and so he didn't make it. The other person who influenced me was a United Methodist preacher who was chairman of the board of SCLC. SCLC got started following the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks and Ralph Abernathy. SCLC was made up of preachers from all over the nation, and they chose as their motto, redeeming the soul of America, causing America to look at itself to see who we really are. The students, of course, in 1960 were beginning to sit in. I got messed up in I graduated from high school in 1960. Y'all saying, "Ooh, he old." You're right. I graduated from high school in 1960. My senior year, I was president of the student council. And in February, I got arrested in Memphis. Now, in North Carolina, in Nashville, the sit-ins started at lunch counters. In Memphis, the sit-ins started at the library. I don't know to this day how a senior in high school ended up at Lemoyne College on a Saturday morning with nothing but college students. We have not figured that out to this day. But when they said we're going to sit in at the libraries, I said yes. Why? In Memphis at that time, there was a Bain library, but in communities you had small libraries, very small. And if you wanted a book, they probably didn't have it. So you had to make an application for that book. They had to send your request downtown, process it, and then send your request back to your library, the book. And so you got the book 3 days after you asked for it. And so we were went to sit in at the library. We have not figured out yet how when we walked into the library and the cars that let us off pull off, the paddy wagon was right behind the library, waiting on us. I was in a peculiar situation because all of the others who got arrested were college students. I was the only high schooler in the group. They went to jail. They could get out the same night on bond. I went to juvenile court. I couldn't get out till Monday when my mother came to sign me out. But there was a burning that said there are some things in this nation, high schooler, that are wrong. And we need to be about the business of righting those wrongs. And so my principal said, the school board said that I could not graduate. My principal said, oh yes, my lad will graduate. And I did. And would you know it, the principal and another teacher, and I'm coming to how the gospel fits into all of this. My principal, who was a graduate of Morehouse, and another instructor there, pulled me out of all of the other young men to be the only student to be interviewed by the recruiter from Atlanta to go to Morehouse. And so I ended up at Morehouse. Special Woodrow Wilson fellow. And would you know it, they were sitting in Atlanta when I got to Atlanta. Dr. King came over to speak to us. He had just come back to Atlanta from Montgomery. And he said to us, I've come to tell you about love, about nonviolence, about justice and peace. And somebody in the group said to him, Dr. King, it's all right to talk to us about it, but show us how it's done. And so Dr. King made a phone call home and went to Rich's department store. Part of the group went to Rich's, part to Davidson's. And we got arrested. Well, Atlanta has a beautiful new jail. And they have a unique system. They've got compartments with 4 sleeping bunk beds in each little section. But in the day, you have to come out into the day room. And you spend the day in the day room. We've got nothing else to do but to listen to Martin King teach about justice, about love, and about peace. Well, I'm convinced. I've been hearing this all my life. My pastor at home has been preaching for years that God is going to send us a Moses who's going to deliver us out of this dilemma. That God is going to free those. And we kept hearing, the problem was that for many of us who were of African descent, our hands were loosed of the shackles. Our feet were loosed of the shackles when we were freed. But the problem was that our minds were still shackled. And as long as there's a shackle on your mind, you're still a slave. Martin King kept telling us that you can't walk bent over unless somebody rides your back. But if you ever stand up, nobody can ride your back. And so the question was, what is it, Doc, that motivates you? What is it that keeps you going? And I heard Dr. King say that Jesus has spoken. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he hath anointed me to preach good news to the poor. That's what gospel is, you know. He hath anointed me to preach good news to the poor. Dr. King, who are the poor? I came from Memphis and we were poor. We couldn't afford the OR. Are you talking about? No. Not where you are economically, but where are you mentally? If you're not rich mentally, then you are automatically poor. If you don't think of yourself as being somebody. And I said, but Dr. King, my grandmama told me when I was 5 that I was somebody. And when I was about 8, she said to me, your feet might be in the mud, but your head ought to be in the stars because you are somebody. I said, Dr. King, I'm not poor. He said, but as long as you've got your spirit right, as long as you understand that your responsibility is to help somebody who might not know the way, then you have received the same spiritual experience that Jesus Christ experienced. But didn't you hear him say in Luke 4, 16, 17, and 18, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. Middlebrook, there are folk who got plenty of money, but they still poor because they have no sense of direction. They have no sense. He has called me and anointed me to preach good news. He has told me to tell the captives that they are free. I hate to tell you tonight, but I'm still trying to tell captive folk that you are free. You are not bound by just the common acceptable beliefs, but you have within you the ability to say to not only yourself, but to everybody, I am somebody, because I'm God's child. So while we were marching, everywhere I went, we were in Mississippi, and Jesse Jackson said to me, Middlebrook, you don't act like you're happy when I say I am somebody. I said, Jesse, I'm happy. I'm with it. But Middlebrook, you're not getting excited. Jesse, I got it. But you got to act like, Jesse, your problem is, baby, you late. Big Mama told me when I was 5 that I was the gospel, the good news, said to me, love those who misuse you. And so you could walk up to a Bull Connors in Birmingham. You could walk up to a Jim Clark in Selma. And they can beat you with their club, but because of the love that is within you, you can endure their suffering and eventually lead them to a point where Jim Clark, before he dies, apologizes to a John Lewis and said, I'm sorry about the stand I took. The gospel says that I love you as I love myself. But I've got to love myself as Jesus loved me. And so the gospel, the good news, the spirit of hope, the spirit of release kept us marching. We soon discovered, and folk were saying that we were just marching for black folk. No. All of us, listen, as long as there's one other person who's down, you are down. But when you move to lift somebody, we said to them, listen, you got us in the ditch, and you got your foot on my neck. You can't tell me how bad I'm hurt in the ditch. But one thing I can tell you, if you ever come out of the ditch with me, I'm coming out with you. And so everybody runs from my neighborhood because they don't. But let me tell you, wherever you go, I'm coming too, because there is a spirit that makes us brothers. There is a spirit that binds us one to the other. And so the movement kept us running. Yes, fire hoses turned on you. Water coming out so strong that it could knock barks off of a tree at 50 feet. Yes, beatings came. But a spirit within you said, you love the hell out of. Oh, I'm sorry. Love them to the point that they find themselves having to join arm in arm with you and say, we shall overcome. And finally, when people came to understand what it was that we were all about, it was not just black folk who were being put down. White women couldn't break the glass ceiling. And why are folk angry now? They're angry because women are no longer in the kitchen barefoot pregnant, but they are mayors and governors. The gospel says that all of us are God's children. All of us have a right to all of the gifts that God has created. None of us have claimed, this is mine. It belongs to all. So what's yours is mine. What's mine is mine. I'll share it with you. I'll help you as we walk together. And so we could easily sing the song. Walk together, children. Don't you get weary. Walk together, children. Don't you get weary. The gospel says you can't crown him until I get there too. The gospel says that I'm always down as long as you are down. But as we reach out a hand to lift each other up, no, I may not have all that you have, but I'm still God's child. I'm still somebody. And so you defeat your enemy who would do you harm with your ability to love them in spite of what they do to you. That's why my big mama, long before I learned the words to it, she was singing it. We adopted it into the civil rights movement. But she said, I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom's way. That's why she said, long before we had it, as we shall overcome someday. The old folk in our church sang, I'll overcome. I'll overcome, I'll overcome. If in my heart I do not yield, I'll overcome. So the gospel, I'm not supposed to holler, right? Yeah. You can do it Sunday. I never shall forget, a little side note, we were at Lennon City in a community revival, and Bishop Swanson was here. Any of y'all remember Bishop Swanson? And Bishop Swanson, who was our frat brother, raised his hand and hollered. And I told some of the members of Lennon City who were sitting there, don't get upset if your pastor hollers Sunday. The bishop has said it's all right now. The movement was based on the principles of Jesus Christ. Love those who despitefully use you. Pray for those who are not concerned about you. Give them your hand, a hand up. Sure, you might not be equal to them financially, but you are God's child. And the gospel says to you that you are somebody. So if they smack you on one cheek, of course our interpretation, and as we've studied in seminary, it says to them, give them the other side. But that's what you do. If they smack you, let them see a better side. Let them hear you say, I love you in spite of what you do. That we are together God's children. And so we sang together, arm in arm. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome. And so personally, I went through Memphis. I went through Atlanta, to Birmingham, to Gadsden, to Danville, Virginia, to Dothan, Alabama, to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, to Selma, Alabama, back to Memphis, back out again. On freedom, many freedom rides. and then all kind. But what was it? The voice of Jesus saying to me, your journey will only end when men and women can stand together, when we can all share together, when we can be free together. And it is only in that day, when we shall hear him who gave his life on Calvary, when we shall hear him who went into the borrowed grave, when we shall hear him who got up that third day morning and made a declaration, all power is in my hand. This nation, this world will only be better when we put the gospel of Jesus Christ into practice and say to men everywhere, you are somebody. And so as I close, I want you to help me say it. I want you to say it real loud. In fact, I don't want the building supervisors to get upset. But you can kind of help me lift the roof. I am. I am. I am somebody. I am somebody. I am. I am. I am somebody. I'm God's child. And because I'm his child, I'll overcome. And so that's what I just came to tell you. The gospel will set you free. The gospel will make you love folk who said they could not love you. The gospel. And listen, don't y'all get hung up. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not correct. Don't get hung up talking about, well, Pastor, they talking about me. If they talking about you, shout. When they quit talking about you, it's when you get worried. Because as long as they're talking about you, you're doing something to have somebody mind on you. But when they quit talking about you, you ain't doing much, baby. You're not doing much. And so I say to you, in the words of the old hymn, a charge to keep I have, a God to glorify, a never dying soul to save, and fitted for the sky, to serve this present age, my calling to fulfill. And oh, may it all my power engage to do my master's will. We shall someday. Amen.
We want to say thank you to Reverend Middlebrook, and he has graciously agreed for those who'd like to stay to do a few minutes of Q&A. So we know at 7 o'clock some of you have other places you have to be. That's okay, but we're going to do some Q&A here. So I'm going to ask, Joey, would you mind to bring a chair up on stage for the Q&A? Thank you. Also, want to share with you, Reverend Middlebrook, that it's okay to talk about loving the hell out of each other in church, right? But because I think that's what Jesus did for us, right? That's what he did for us, and I think that's what so many of us see in the work of the civil rights movement and in the ways that we are still working to love those who disagree, love those who don't love us, and to love all, as you've so eloquently spoken about tonight. So thank you so much for being here this evening. You can be seated. If you need to, if you have a program here at church, if you have somewhere you've got to be, we understand. I do not want to draw the wrath of the choir director upon myself. I have learned that the very first choir director I ever worked with as a pastor came to me my second week at work and said, "Listen, Will, here's what you need to know about church musicians. You can't have church without them, and you can't shoot them." So, and I have learned that if your musicians are happy, the church is happy. And we have great musicians here. So we understand. We want to go now into the Q&A. And does anybody have a question for Reverend Middlebrook? Okay, on what brought you to Knoxville?
I was pastoring a little church in West Tennessee called Bolivar. And we were in our state convention meeting. And they pulled the wool on me and called me up to preach without a notice. And I preached. And 3 people came to me and said, "Our pastor is leaving. Would you consider coming to preach at our church?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll come preach." And I came. And so they said, "Come back." And so I came back. And so they said, we'll call you in a couple of days. And that was February of 1977. And I thought I was going to stay 5 years. And now I've been here 48. And looks like with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, I'm not going anywhere now.
What was it like being with Martin Luther King?
What was it like to be with Dr. King? You were in the presence of greatness. You knew it, but because he was so humble with it, it was difficult to recognize. Let me tell you something that happened. On the night of April 3rd, 1968, there was a tornado warning out in Memphis. And Dr. King was haggard and tired, and we were supposed to go to Mason Temple for the mass meeting. Well, we got there, and there were about 1,200 people there. Crowd was kind of down. And when we walked in, it looked like somebody poured cold water on the place. So Dr. Abernathy said, "Take me to a payphone," and we did. And he called Dr. King and said, "You've got to come over. This crowd is not my crowd." Because Dr. Abernathy was going to speak. So when Dr. King got there, Dr. Abernathy said, "We get in a big hurry to present greatness. But sometimes we need to take our time and just introduce greatness among us." He said, "And y'all can't go nowhere because of the tornado. So I'm going to take my time and introduce Dr. King." Took him 45 minutes. And Dr. King was saying, "Hush, Rev. Hush, Rev." And we recognized his humility. Now, Dr. King could tell some real clean, funny jokes. He loved to swim. Most of you here will never know because he never talked about it. But in the late 50s, he was stabbed in New York with a deranged woman with a letter opener. And they carried him to the hospital. And they asked the surgeons what was his prognosis and how, and the doctor was Dr. E.B. Davidson, who was doing his internship, who later ended up here in Knoxville. And Dr. Davidson said, if he had sneezed, he would have died. So a little girl in White Plains, New York, wrote him a letter and said, I'm glad you didn't sneeze. Dr. King never talked about that experience. But the night of April 3rd, knowing that death was upon him, he talked about that experience. His humility was of such that you never knew if he was feeling bad, because he always tried. So being in the presence of Dr. King was a motivating joy. It was a motivating experience that caused you to know that you had been in the presence of greatness. And that one of the interesting things was, he saw no big eyes and little you. He could walk into a crowd, and if he saw one person in the crowd that he knew, he had a way of making the whole crowd feel like they were part of him. But he kept inspiring. So I think part of what keeps me going is the fact that he saw a young boy from Wellington Street in Memphis who used to roll old car tires and play cowboys and Indians with a stick for a horse, but who would take me into his family. And he and his dad said that I was a part of the family. So he was great. And you got that impression just being around him. Does that help you? Yeah. Anybody else?
What's your favorite quote?
What's my favorite quote? You know, nobody's ever asked me that. I really think my favorite one would be his last statement. I've been to the mountaintop. I might not get there with you, but we as a people are going to get to the promised land. And I think, as I think about it, that would be one of my favorite quotes, because it said to me that if we all keep struggling together, whatever the problem is, we can find the solution. And we can find the solution together. And I think the other thing that it says is, he said, I may not get to the mountaintop. One of the problems, when Jesus was crucified, the disciples kind of scattered, and they had to be drawn kind of back together. When Dr. King was killed, we kind of immediately came together to say, what is the next step? Now the problem for me is, does God have to send us another one leader for us to come together? Or can we really come together as a people to find out how to solve the problems of hunger, of sickness, of disease, of neglect? And so I think I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. At my age now, you know, I was just telling somebody coming in, I celebrated the day. I sent him a note. My friend Andrew Young was 93 today, the ambassador. My friend Otis Moss Jr. a couple of days ago was 90. I'm 83. And so I realized that I don't have a long time here. But my desire is to see us come together. I want to see Knoxville come together. Don't just live on one side of the town and never be concerned about what happens on the other. Because ultimately, whatever happens affects all of us. And Knoxville can't be what Knoxville has the possibility to be if we don't join hands and make this city. We can make it. Just because other folks call us the scruffy city doesn't mean we have to develop the attitude. And remember one thing, that whatever happens in East Knoxville ultimately affects Concord. Preach, Middlebrook. Because we are. We're one. Yeah. One of the things I thought for a long time was, I have a dream, and I still dream. But Malcolm X said to Martin King one day after the I Have a Dream speech, he said, "Be careful, because you got to keep working, otherwise your dream becomes a nightmare." And I don't want to see the dream become a nightmare. Does that help you?
Dr. Middlebrook, do you think that as a nation we're backtracking from when Dr. King was here? We've made strides, but it seems like we take one step forward and 2 steps back.
No, we're taking 3 steps back. Yes. I listen. I'm telling the people at Canaan and everywhere I go. Number 1, pray mightily. Pray mightily. Together we stick. Divided we stuck. And unless we come together to do what needs to be for all of the people, one of the things that's troubling me is, you heard me, I've got 5 great-grandchildren. The youngest one will just be 2 months old tomorrow. I've lived through the struggle. I've lived through the difficult times. I've lived through times when it was hard to make it. My concern now is not about me. My concern is what's going to happen to them. They have not only have they not had to live through the struggle, we forgot to tell them what the struggle is. Because we've become so satisfied within ourselves that we've made it, that we don't want to tell them. Maybe all of y'all have, but I have to tell my great-grands and my grand, I haven't always had a car. There were times when I was growing up in Memphis, and the city bus ran right down in front of our house. And we didn't have enough money to pay bus fare, so we had to walk. And now there's nobody in my house, basically, but my wife and me and my son just came back for a short time. So there are 4 cars in the driveway. You can't drive but one of them at a time. But we haven't told our children. And everybody in here wasn't born where you are now. You've had to come through some struggles, through some difficult times. And so don't make your children think that you've always been where you are now. They need to know what it means to struggle, to sacrifice. You know, nowadays our children say, I want this, I want that. And we say, well, I can't get it right now. Why you can't get, I don't have any money in my pocket. Well, write a check. And then they tell you, use your American Express. And what do? I mean, my great-grandson plays basketball, football, well, all of them, soccer. And so they want name brands. And sometimes I tell them, no, you don't get the name brand. Not that I can't afford to give it to them, but they need to understand that sometimes you got to struggle to get some of what you want. Preach, Middlebrook. That's right. They want what they want, and they want it day before yesterday. And I'm not criticizing you. It ain't your fault. It's our fault. Because until we come to understand that the gospel says, I'm concerned right now about starving people in Africa, in Asia, and I'm not being political, but you can't talk about make America great again without talking about how do you reach out a hand to help. For remember, it is in giving, I believe that's in the book, isn't it, that you receive. And the more you give, the more you receive. Not always monetarily, but you can get a peace of mind because at night you can say, if I can help, I wish I could sing, somebody as I pass along, then my living shall not be in vain. So yes, I'm concerned. I'm praying every day. I'm praying that we come together and teach our young folk how to make it through difficult times, because the prophet in me sees a difficult time on the horizon. I'm not just a preacher. I'm a prophet. He's a prophet. And so when he stands to proclaim, he has to be able to tell you what the Lord says. And you can get mad with him. But there's one thing you got to do. Remember, your arms are too short to box with God. Did I? Yeah, yes, ma'am.
Let's see. I see two more questions, so let's have two more.
As someone who has dedicated much of your life to service and service of a community, of our community for many of those years, what do you believe is the most important step that we can take to create lasting positive changes in our communities today?
Well, number one is, I think I started alluding to some of it. We've got to get to know each other. We've got to learn how to talk to each other. That I hope I'm wrong, but there are some folk in here right now, probably, or was, that if you ask them to name 5 African-American black citizens, they couldn't do it. Which means we don't understand who we are. And I go back to together we stick, divided we stuck. So that if we don't operate as a community, yeah, there might be different ideals, but somehow or the other, folk have got to start talking not at each other, but to each other. We've got to build friendships, relationships. Let me tell you a problem that I'm having. 43 years ago, the Lord led me to call people together to start a combined Martin Luther King celebration in this city. It grew that we are the only city in the South that's larger than us is Atlanta in terms of our celebration. We have every year a parade. One of the things that frustrates me is I have not been able to get Farragut High School's band to come to the parade not one year. And when I keep asking, they keep telling me, we've got activities planned. It's a holiday. You ain't got no doggone activity planned. That until we can realize that we are all one and share, so I don't want to go to my grave. For 20-some years, I spoke to the intermediate school at Farragut when young men were going off. I came back out here to work with faculty and with the principals because what happens in Farragut affects me in East Knoxville. This is one city. And the gospel says that we've got to come together if we're going to survive. And so what is the one thing to me? We need to start talking to each other. We need to start sharing with each other. I was just telling my friend Brother Bales back there. He's pastoring now not far from me. So I was just telling him that we're going to get together in a couple of days. And we're going to figure out how our two churches can share. For a number of years, our church shared with Church of the Savior. John Lackey was the pastor. We talked. We planned together. Joint Lenten services. This Wednesday we would be at Church of the Savior. Next Wednesday we were at Canaan. We shared meals together. When members of the church family, either one of them, had death in their family, said, we came to the rescue of each other. And then all of a sudden something happened. And there's a wall thrown up. And we don't talk to each other. And so we lose our sense of being. When I say we lose, whoever does not talk to each other, you can really grow when you learn to share. Now, I don't know whether that helps you, but we got to figure out how to come together. And the best place to do it is around the church. Martin King said that 11 o'clock Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. And what troubles me, thank God our situation is a little different at Canaan. But what troubles me is that people say to African Americans, you ought to come to our church to worship. Well, I want to say to you, you ought to come to our church. I don't think I'm such a bad preacher. Okay. Yeah. We have to share. We have to share. We have to share ideals, share principles, share concerns. Don't be in like poor Lazarus ends up. You get raised from the dead, and there are folk outside the house trying to figure out how to kill you again.
All right, one more question. I think we had one back here. Okay, same quick marching orders. What is there one thing that you would encourage folks as they go tonight? One thing to think about, one thing to consider doing, but one thing somebody could do to make a difference.
Yeah, I'm doing a series at Canaan on the way to Calvary. The experiences that Jesus had with different folks and their different problems, as an example to us that we have the same kinds of problems. One of the things I said to Canaan Sunday, I just ran across it. Well, I've been reading, but Jesus sits himself by the treasury. I believe it's in Mark chapter 12, beginning at verse 41. He sits himself by the treasury, and he watches as folk are putting in their money, some large amounts. A woman, the Bible says, a poor widow. Any of y'all know that story? Drops in 2 mites. And Jesus says something. Jesus calls his disciples and said, of everybody that put in, she's the greatest. They put in based on their abundance. She put in on her want. What they put in, they still had some left. She gave everything. What would happen if the hymn became part of our lives? All to Jesus I surrender. All to him I freely give. And he's in heaven. So we can't send it there. If we're going to freely give, we've got to reach out to each other, to the least, the lost, and the left out, and say to the Lord, I'm giving you my all. What do we do as stewardships with our time, our talent, our influence? Not just our resources, but with our influence. How do we help somebody else to be better and to be bigger? And when you give of yourself totally, you don't have any problem sleeping. You can sit down to read, watch Matt Larkin, because you've given. Yeah.
We have a lot to be thankful for this evening. I think there are going to be some interesting conversations at the next Farragut Band Parents meeting when they're asked to sign up to work at the concession stand. I also want to share with you this, and Reverend Middlebrook, you might not like to hear this, but I need to say it because I have to live with these people, and they're going to want me to say it, and that's that you talked about what it was like to be in the presence of greatness, and we thank you for bringing that to us tonight. We feel like we have too, and we appreciate this time with you very much. God bless you all. Go in peace.